Question 1. Rulemaking and regulations. In a situation where formal requirements conflict with practical implementation of agency regulations, a regulatory agency must issue a new rule under the Administrative Procedure Act (APA). The agency claims that the rule is an interpretive rule and therefore does not require notice and comment rulemaking. However, several affected stakeholders argue that the rule substantively alters legal rights and obligations and should have undergone the rulemaking process under APA Section 553. What is the most legally sound position? A. The agency is correct because interpretive rules are exempt from notice and comment procedures under the APA. B. The stakeholders are correct because any agency rule that affects legal rights must follow formal rulemaking procedures. C. The agency is correct if the rule only clarifies existing law rather than creating new obligations. D. The stakeholders are correct because agencies cannot bypass rulemaking procedures by labeling a rule interpretive. Answer. C. The agency is correct if the rule only clarifies existing law rather than creating new obligations. Explanation. Under APA Section 553, substantive or legislative rules require notice and comment rulemaking, while interpretive rules do not. Interpretive rules explain or clarify existing statutes or regulations without creating new rights or obligations. Courts have consistently ruled that if an rule substantively affects legal rights, it is a legislative rule and must follow notice and comment procedures. Perez v. Mortgage Bankers Assand, 575 U.S. 92, 2015. However, if the rule merely provides an agency's interpretation of an existing statute or rule, it does not require formal rulemaking. The correct answer is C, because an interpretive rule is valid only if it does not impose new legal burdens. If the rule substantively changes obligations, stakeholders can challenge it under judicial review standards for improper rulemaking. Question 2. Judicial review of administrative actions. During a comprehensive review of a process that needs improvement, a federal agency issues a rule requiring all businesses within a regulated industry to adopt costly compliance measures. A trade association challenges the rule, arguing that the agency's decision was arbitrary and capricious under the Administrative Procedure Act. Under which circumstances is court most likely to rule in favor of the trade association? A. If the agency failed to provide rational explanation supported by substantial evidence. B. If the agency did not consider public comments before finalizing the rule. C. If the rule imposes financial costs on businesses beyond what Congress originally intended. D. If the agency used informal rulemaking instead of formal rulemaking procedures. Answer. A. If the agency failed to provide a rational explanation supported by substantial evidence. Explanation. Under the Administrative Procedure Act (APA), Section 706, 2a, courts can set aside agency actions that are arbitrary, capricious, an abuse of discretion, or otherwise not in accordance with the law. This standard was reinforced in Motor Vehicle Manufacturers Assand v. State Farm, 463 U.S. 29, 1983, where the Supreme Court held that an agency must provide reasoned explanation based on relevant facts for its decision. Answer is correct because if an agency fails to provide logical and evidence-based justification for its rule, court may overturn it. While public comments, B, are important under notice and comment rulemaking, failing to consider every individual comment does not automatically invalidate rule. Answer C is incorrect because an agency has broad discretion to impose regulatory costs as long as it operates within its statutory authority. Answer D is incorrect because the APA generally permits informal rulemaking unless statute requires formal procedures. Question 3. Procedural due process in administrative law. While investigating inconsistencies across various units, a state administrative agency revokes a company's business license for alleged violations of state environmental regulations. The agency does not provide the company with formal hearing before revoking the license, arguing that an administrative appeal process is available. The company challenges the revocation, claiming violation of procedural due process. Which of the following best reflects the company's strongest legal argument? A. The agency's failure to provide pre-deprivation hearing violates the Matthews v. Eldridge test for procedural protections. B. Agencies have broad discretion in enforcing regulations, and businesses are not entitled to procedural due process in regulatory matters. C. The agency's decision is valid as long as the company has an opportunity for judicial review after revocation. D. The agency's revocation is valid because economic interests, such as business licenses, do not trigger due process protections. Answer A. The agency's failure to provide pre-deprivation hearing violates the Matthews v. Eldridge test for procedural protections. Explanation. Under the Due Process Clause of the Fifth and 14th Amendments, administrative agencies must provide adequate procedural safeguards before depriving individuals or businesses of life, liberty, or property. In Matthews v. Eldridge, 424 U.S. 319, 1976, the Supreme Court established balancing test to determine the required level of procedural due process, considering the private interest affected by the agency action, the risk of erroneous deprivation, and the value of additional safeguards. The government's interest, including administrative efficiency. Business license is considered property interest, meaning that procedural due process applies. Answer is correct because if an agency revokes business license without pre-deprivation hearing, the company has strong legal claim under Matthews. Answer B is incorrect because due process applies even in regulatory enforcement. Answer C is incorrect because post-deprivation remedies are not always sufficient. Answer D is incorrect because economic interests can trigger due process protections in certain cases. Question 4. During a major transformation where existing methods must be adapted to comply with newly enacted regulations, an administrative agency is tasked with revising its rulemaking process to align with updated statutory mandates. The agency has traditionally relied on informal rulemaking but is now considering adopting formal rulemaking procedures to enhance transparency and legal defensibility. However, stakeholders argue formal rulemaking is unnecessarily rigid and may slow down the implementation of critical policies. Given the Administrative Procedure Act, APA, and relevant case law, how should the agency proceed in deciding whether to use formal or informal rulemaking? A. The agency should conduct a cost-benefit analysis, and if formal rulemaking imposes excessive delays, revert to informal rulemaking even if the statute suggests otherwise. B. The agency must adhere to formal rulemaking if the enabling statute explicitly requires it, but it may use informal rulemaking if the statute is silent on procedural requirements. C. The agency should hold a public referendum on whether to use formal or informal rulemaking, as this ensures democratic legitimacy and compliance with public interest. D. The agency should consult the judiciary before implementing any rule to preempt potential legal challenges and ensure compliance with constitutional principles. Answer B. The agency must adhere to formal rulemaking if the enabling statute explicitly requires it, but it may use informal rulemaking if the statute is silent on procedural requirements. Explanation. Under the Administrative Procedure Act, APA, Section 553, agencies typically engage in informal rulemaking, which requires only notice and comment procedures. However, if Congress mandates formal rulemaking through statutory language such as rules shall be made on the record after opportunity for an agency hearing, the agency is legally bound to follow the formal rulemaking process, which involves trial-like proceedings, sworn testimony, and cross-examinations. Option is incorrect because agencies cannot choose rulemaking procedures solely based on efficiency concerns if statutory mandates exist. Vermont Yankee Nuclear Power Corp. v. ARDC 1978 reinforced that agencies must follow the procedures outlined by Congress. Option C is incorrect because public referendums are not a recognized method for determining agency procedures under administrative law. Agencies are accountable to statutory directives rather than direct public votes. Option D is incorrect because agencies do not preemptively consult the judiciary before rulemaking. Judicial review occurs after a rule is challenged in court. The Chevron deference principle applies when courts review agency interpretations of ambiguous statutes. Question 5. While investigating a complicated issue between different federal agencies, a conflict arises regarding the scope of their regulatory authority. Agency A claims jurisdiction over a particular environmental regulation, while Agency B asserts that it has the primary enforcement authority under a separate statutory framework. The dispute results in inconsistent enforcement actions and confusion for regulated entities. Under principles of administrative law, how should this jurisdictional dispute be resolved? A. The President should issue an executive order designating one agency as the lead regulator, overriding conflicting statutory mandates. B. The agencies should enter into an interagency memorandum of understanding (MOU) to clarify enforcement responsibilities and establish cooperative mechanisms. C. Congress must pass an immediate legislative amendment to specify the jurisdiction of each agency, as administrative bodies lack authority to resolve disputes on their own. D. The Supreme Court must intervene directly under the separation of powers doctrine and issue a binding interpretation of the agency's statutory mandates. Answer. B. The agencies should enter into an interagency memorandum of understanding to clarify enforcement responsibilities and establish cooperative mechanisms. Explanation. Jurisdictional disputes between agencies often arise due to overlapping statutory authority. In such cases, agencies can resolve conflicts through interagency cooperation mechanisms, including memoranda of understanding (MOUs). These agreements delineate enforcement priorities, resource allocation, and regulatory coordination. Option is incorrect because the President cannot unilaterally override statutory authority granted to agencies by Congress. While executive orders can influence administrative policy, they cannot contradict legislative mandates. Option C is incorrect because while Congress has the ultimate authority to clarify statutes, it is not a practical or immediate solution. Agencies often need to resolve disputes in real time without waiting for new legislation. Option D is incorrect because courts, including the Supreme Court, generally do not intervene in interagency disputes unless there is a clear statutory conflict that requires judicial interpretation. The Chevron and Skidmore deference principles apply when courts review agency interpretations of ambiguous statutes. Question 6. In a situation where formal requirements conflict with practical enforcement considerations, an administrative agency is struggling to balance due process protections with the need for swift regulatory action. A recent statutory amendment imposes stricter procedural safeguards on agency adjudications, requiring additional pre-hearing notices and evidentiary disclosures. However, the agency argues that these requirements create unnecessary delays in enforcing public health and safety regulations. How should the agency proceed in addressing this procedural conflict? A. The agency must strictly comply with the new procedural safeguards, as due process is a constitutional requirement that cannot be overridden for efficiency reasons. B. The agency should apply the Matthews v. Eldridge balancing test to determine whether the procedural safeguards are necessary given the nature of the interests at stake. C. The agency may ignore the procedural safeguards if they interfere with the agency's ability to enforce public health and safety regulations effectively. D. The agency should issue an internal policy memorandum instructing administrative law judges out to limit procedural safeguards where possible to expedite resolutions. Answer. B. The agency should apply the Matthews v. Eldridge balancing test to determine whether the procedural safeguards are necessary given the nature of the interests at stake. Explanation. The Matthews v. Eldridge 1976 balancing test is the leading framework for evaluating procedural due process requirements in administrative adjudications. It assesses the private interest affected by the government action, the risk of erroneous deprivation of such interest through current procedures, the government's interest, including administrative burdens and public policy goals. Option is incorrect because while due process is constitutionally protected and not absolute, the courts assess whether additional safeguards are proportionate to the interests at stake. Option C is incorrect because agencies cannot unilaterally bypass statutory procedural safeguards even in the name of efficiency. Goldberg v. Kelly 1970 established that procedural due process applies even in urgent regulatory matters. Option D is incorrect because agency instructions cannot override statutory mandates or judicially recognized due process requirements. Administrative law judges also operate independently and cannot be directed to ignore procedural requirements. Question 7. In the context of expanding agency discretion, an administrative body seeks to adopt new enforcement guidelines that allow it to impose civil penalties without formal adjudication. The agency justifies this change by citing the need for swift enforcement action to deter regulatory violations. However, affected parties argue that this policy denies them due process. How should the agency address these concerns while maintaining effective enforcement? A. The agency must provide a full trial-like hearing before imposing any civil penalties as required under the Due Process Clause. B. The agency may impose civil penalties through informal procedures as long as affected parties have a meaningful opportunity for judicial review. C. The agency should allow regulated entities to appeal penalties internally before judicial review is available, ensuring procedural fairness. D. The agency abandon the policy, as civil penalties require formal adjudication under the Administrative Procedure Act (APAT). Answer: B. The agency may impose civil penalties through informal procedures as long as affected parties have a meaningful opportunity for judicial review. Explanation: under Matthews v. Eldridge 1976, agencies may balance due process protections with administrative efficiency, while Goldberg v. Kelly 1970 required hearings for certain benefits terminations. Agencies can impose penalties without formal adjudication if they provide post-deprivation remedies and an opportunity for judicial review. Option is incorrect because due process does not always require a trial-like hearing. Agencies may use informal adjudication if there is an adequate avenue for challenging penalties. Option C is partially correct, but internal appeals alone do not satisfy due process if judicial review is unavailable or too limited. Option D is incorrect because the APA does not universally require formal adjudication for civil penalties unless specified by statute. Question 8. During a rulemaking process, an agency receives extensive public comments criticizing a proposed regulation as too vague. The agency revises the rule significantly before finalizing it, introducing new provisions that were not part of the original proposal. Stakeholders argue that they were deprived of an opportunity to comment on these new provisions. How should a court evaluate whether the agency complied with the notice and requirements under the APA? A. The agency fully complied as long as it responded to the original comments and justified the final rule's changes. B. The agency must restart the notice and comment process if the final rule is not a logical outgrowth of the proposed rule. C. The agency is allowed to make substantive changes as long as the final rule remains within the agency's general regulatory authority. D. The agency's revisions are permissible as long as it post-rulemaking statement allowing stakeholders to challenge the changes. Answer: B. The agency must restart the notice and comment process if the final rule is not a logical outgrowth of the proposed rule. Explanation: the logical outgrowth test determines whether the final rule is a reasonable extension of the proposed rule. If stakeholders lacked fair notice of the revisions and were deprived of the opportunity to comment, the rule may be invalid. Environmental Integrity Project v. APA 2004 reaffirmed that agencies cannot introduce entirely new regulatory provisions without further public notice. Option is incorrect because responding to comments is not sufficient if stakeholders never had a chance to comment on the final changes. Option C is incorrect because an agency's authority does not override procedural requirements. Option D is incorrect because post-rulemaking statements do not substitute for public participation. Question 9. An agency issues an interpretive rule clarifying how it will enforce a regulation but does not go through the notice and comment process. A regulated entity challenges the rule, arguing that it imposes new legal obligations and should have been subject to APA rulemaking procedures. How should the court determine whether the agency's action was lawful? A. The court should defer to the agency's interpretation under Chevron deference if the statute is ambiguous. B. The court should apply the paralyzed veterans doctrine, requiring notice and comment for any significant policy shift. C. The court should examine whether the rule is merely an interpretation or actually imposes binding obligations on regulated entities. D. The court should uphold the rule as long as the agency has reasonable basis its interpretation. Answer: C. The court should examine whether the rule is merely an interpretation or actually imposes binding obligations on regulated entities. Explanation: interpretive rules do not require notice and comment unless they create new legal obligations. Courts apply the Perez v. Mortgage Bankers Asan 2015 standard, which eliminated the paralyzed veterans doctrine and held that agencies can issue interpretive rules without rulemaking unless the rule substantively changes existing obligations. Option is incorrect because Chevron deference applies to statutory interpretation, not procedural challenges. Option B is incorrect because the paralyzed veterans doctrine was overruled. Option D is incorrect because an agency's reasonable interpretation does not excuse procedural violations. Question 10. An agency issues a rule that conflicts with an earlier judicial decision interpreting the same statute. The agency argues that under Chevron deference, courts must defer to its reasonable interpretation. The affected party argues that the agency's rule should be invalidated because it contradicts established judicial precedent. How should court resolve this conflict? A. The court must defer to the agency's interpretation as long as it is reasonable. B. The court should strike down the rule because agencies cannot override judicial precedent. C. The court should distinguish between statutory gaps and judicially interpreted provisions, deferring to the agency only when the statute is ambiguous. D. The agency must petition Congress to amend the statute if it wants to change the interpretation. Answer: C. The court should distinguish between statutory gaps and judicially interpreted provisions, deferring to the agency only when the statute is ambiguous. Explanation: Chevron deference applies only if the statute is ambiguous and Congress has not directly spoken on the issue. However, under Brand X 2005, if a court has previously interpreted a statute without deferring to an agency, the agency may adopt a reasonable interpretation unless the judicial decision found the statute to be unambiguous. Option is incorrect because deference does not apply if the court's prior ruling found the statute unambiguous. Option B is incorrect because Brand X allows agencies to adopt contrary interpretation in some cases. Option D is incorrect because agencies do not need Congress to amend statute if deference applies. Question 11. In a high-stakes environment where multiple challenges must be addressed simultaneously, an agency seeks to introduce an emergency regulation without going through the standard notice and comment process. The agency justifies its action by citing an urgent public safety concern. However, industry stakeholders argue that bypassing the usual procedural safeguards undermines transparency and fairness. Under what conditions can an agency lawfully implement an emergency regulation without violating the Administrative Procedure Act, APA? A. If the agency can demonstrate a compelling public interest that outweighs procedural concerns, it may bypass notice and comment requirements. B. An agency may issue an emergency regulation without public participation, but it must justify the rule under the good cause or exception in the APA. C. Agencies are always required to follow notice and comment rulemaking regardless of urgency to ensure transparency and accountability. Emergency regulations may be issued without procedural safeguards but must be reviewed and approved by a federal court within 30 days. Answer: B. An agency may issue an emergency regulation without public participation, but it must justify the rule under the good cause exception in the APA. Explanation: The APA provides a good cause exception under 5 U.S.C. SS 553b, allowing agencies to bypass notice and comment procedures if following them would be impracticable, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. Courts scrutinize such claims carefully. Option is incorrect because an agency cannot ignore APA procedures solely based on general public interest argument. It must meet the legal standard for good cause. Option C is incorrect because the APA does allow exceptions for emergencies. Option D is incorrect because there is no requirement for automatic judicial review of emergency rules. Question 12. During a comprehensive review of a process that needs improvement, an agency reevaluates its reliance on informal adjudication rather than formal adjudication for resolving disputes. Some stakeholders argue that informal adjudication lacks transparency and consistency, while the agency maintains that it enhances efficiency. What factors should the agency consider when determining whether to use informal or formal adjudication? A. The complexity of the disputes, statutory requirements, and the need for procedural safeguards. B. The agency's internal policy preferences, independent of statutory guidelines. C. The political influence of stakeholders who may be affected by the decision. D. The speed of decision-making is the only relevant factor. Answer: A. The complexity of the disputes, statutory requirements, and the need for procedural safeguards. Explanation: Agencies must determine whether formal adjudication requiring a hearing or informal adjudication flexible decision-making processes is appropriate. Under the APA, formal adjudication is required when statutes mandate a hearing on the record. Courts also examine due process concerns based on the Matthews v. Eldridge 1976 balancing test. Option B is incorrect because agency preferences alone cannot override statutory mandates. Option C is incorrect because political influence should not determine procedural choices. Option D is incorrect because efficiency is a factor but not the sole determinant. Question 13. When implementing backup procedures across various regulatory agencies, conflicting interpretations of a key statute arise. One agency argues for a broad interpretation that grants it discretionary enforcement authority, while another advocates for a narrow reading that limits such discretion. Under the Chevron doctrine, how should a reviewing court evaluate the competing agency interpretations? A. The court must defer to the agency that enforces the statute most frequently. B. The court should determine whether Congress has spoken clearly on the issue. If the statute is ambiguous, it should defer to the agency's reasonable interpretation. C. The court should adopt the narrow interpretation because broad agency discretion raises constitutional concerns. D. The court should independently interpret the statute without considering agency views. Answer: B. The court should determine whether Congress has spoken clearly on the issue. If the statute is ambiguous, it should defer to the agency's reasonable interpretation. Explanation: under Chevron U.S. Inc. v. Natural Resources, Defense Counsel 1984, courts follow two-step test. Step 1. If Congress has spoken clearly, the agency must follow the interpretation. Step 2. If the statute is ambiguous, the court defers to the agency's interpretation as long as it is reasonable. Option is incorrect because frequency of enforcement does not determine deference. Option C is incorrect because courts do not automatically favor narrow interpretations. Option D is incorrect because Chevron requires deference to reasonable agency interpretation. Question 14. While analyzing the root causes of sequential problems in administrative decision-making, a court finds that an agency's new policy contradicts long-standing rule without providing an adequate explanation. The affected party challenges the policy change as arbitrary and capricious. How should the court assess this claim under the Administrative Procedure Act? A. The court should automatically invalidate the policy change because agencies must always follow precedent. B. The court should evaluate whether the agency provided reasoned explanation for the policy shift as required under State Farm. C. The court should defer to the agency's decision as long as it was issued through proper procedures. D. The court should determine whether the affected party suffered financial harm before considering the policy's legality. Answer: B. The court should evaluate whether the agency provided a reasoned explanation for the policy shift as required under State Farm. Explanation: in Motor Vehicle Manufacturers Association v. State Farm, 1983, the Supreme Court held that agency decisions must be reasoned and explained to avoid being arbitrary and capricious under the APAS SS 706. 2A standard. Option is incorrect because agencies can change policies, but they must justify the shift. Option C is incorrect because procedural compliance alone is not enough. Agencies must show rational decision-making. Option D is incorrect because the legal test does not require proof of financial harm. Question 15. While investigating a complicated issue between different regulatory agencies, a dispute arises over which agency has the authority to regulate a new form of financial technology. Agency claims jurisdiction under its broad mandate to oversee financial transactions, while Agency B asserts that the technology falls under its regulatory scope because it involves consumer data protection. The agencies have conflicting interpretations of their governing statutes. How should a court resolve this dispute under administrative law principles? A. The court should apply Chevron deference and uphold the interpretation of the agency that has greater expertise in financial transactions. B. The court should apply the arbitrary and capricious standard and strike down both agencies' claims if they lack reasonable basis. C. The court should determine whether Congress clearly addressed the issue and, if not, defer to the agency with the more reasonable interpretation. D. The court should require the agencies to joint regulatory framework before making decision. Answer: C. The court should determine whether Congress clearly addressed the issue and, if not, defer to the agency with the more reasonable interpretation. Explanation: this question tests the Chevron deference principle established in Chevron U.S. Inc. v. Natural Resources, Defense Counsel Inc. 1984. Under Step 1 of the Chevron framework, the court first determines whether Congress has directly spoken on the precise question at issue. If the statute is clear, the agency must follow the congressional intent. If the statute is ambiguous, the court moves to Step 2, where it evaluates whether the agency's interpretation is reasonable. In cases involving two agencies with conflicting interpretations, courts often examine which agency is primary expert over the subject matter. If Congress has not designated single agency to regulate the issue, the court will defer to the more reasonable agency interpretation rather than picking an arbitrary winner. This ensures that regulatory gaps are filled in a way that aligns with administrative law principles and legislative intent. Options A and B are incorrect because Chevron deference does not automatically favor one agency over another based on expertise alone, nor does the arbitrary and capricious standard apply in this context. Option D is also incorrect because courts do not require agencies to submit joint regulatory frameworks unless explicitly mandated by law. Question 16. During an emergency response where multiple areas are impacted, an agency issues an interim final rule without going through the standard notice and comment procedures required by the Administrative Procedure Act (APA). The rule imposes significant new obligations on businesses, and some stakeholders challenge its validity. Under administrative law, when can an agency bypass normal rulemaking requirements? A. When an agency determines that notice and comment procedures are impractical, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. B. When an agency is acting under direct congressional authorization to implement emergency regulations. C. When an agency has published a preliminary draft of the rule for voluntary public input before finalizing it. D. When an agency deems that the costs of compliance for regulated entities are not burdensome. Answer A. When an agency determines that notice and comment procedures are impractical, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. Explanation under 5 U.S.C. SS 553. B of the Administrative Procedure Act (APA), an agency may issue rule without prior notice and comment if it finds a good cause to bypass the process. This good cause exemption applies when following normal rulemaking would be impractical, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. Courts generally uphold these emergency rules when agencies provide well-reasoned justification demonstrating the urgency situation. Option B is partially correct but does not fully capture the APA's requirements. Direct congressional authorization is not always required for emergency rulemaking. Option C is incorrect because merely publishing draft for voluntary input does not satisfy formal APA notice and comment procedures. Option D is incorrect because economic burdens on regulated entities are not factor in determining whether an agency can skip notice and comment rulemaking. Question 17. In a multi-location scenario where consistency requirements differ between jurisdictions, a federal agency creates a rule that sets a uniform standard across all states. However, some states argue that the rule oversteps federal authority and encroaches on state regulatory powers. How should a court evaluate whether the agency's rule is legally valid? A. By determining whether Congress clearly intended to preempt state law through statutory authority. B. By applying the arbitrary and capricious standard to assess whether the agency acted unreasonably. C. By requiring the agency to negotiate with states before enforcing the rule. D. By evaluating whether the rule imposes an undue burden on businesses operating across multiple states. Answer A. By determining whether Congress clearly intended to preempt state law through statutory authority. Explanation. This question involves federal preemption, which occurs when a federal law or regulation supersedes conflicting state laws. Courts analyze preemption claims under express, field, or conflict preemption doctrines. Express preemption. Congress explicitly states that federal law overrides state regulations. Field preemption. Congress intended federal regulation to completely occupy a policy area. Conflict preemption, when complying with both federal and state regulations is impossible, or state law frustrates the purpose of federal law. In cases where an agency creates uniform standards across states, courts examine whether Congress granted the agency preemptive authority in the statute. If so, states cannot enforce conflicting rules. Option B is incorrect because arbitrary and capricious review applies to agency decision-making but does not resolve federal preemption questions. Option C is incorrect because agencies are not required to negotiate with states unless Congress imposes such a requirement. Option D is incorrect because economic burdens on businesses do not determine whether a federal rule preempts state law. Question 18. When implementing new protocols in a shared environment where different agencies must collaborate, a conflict arises regarding the extent of one agency's enforcement authority over another agency's jurisdiction. The agency implementing the protocols asserts its authority based on broad statutory language, while the other argues that the rule interferes with its legally defined responsibilities. How should reviewing court resolve? Issue under administrative law principles. A. By determining whether the enforcing agency's interpretation of its jurisdiction is reasonable under Chevron deference. B. By assessing whether both agencies can enforce conflicting regulations simultaneously without direct conflict. C. By requiring congressional clarification before allowing enforcement actions to proceed. D. By striking down the protocol as exceeding statutory authority due to jurisdictional overlap. Answer A. By determining whether the enforcing agency's interpretation of its jurisdiction is reasonable under Chevron deference. Explanation: in cases where an agency interprets its own jurisdiction, courts apply Chevron deference to determine whether the agency's interpretation is reasonable. Under Chevron Step 1, the court first examines whether Congress has spoken directly to the issue. If the statute is ambiguous, Chevron Step 2 applies, where the court defers to the agency's reasonable interpretation even if another agency disagrees. Courts generally favor congressional intent over conflicting agency claims unless one agency has been explicitly granted primary jurisdiction. If ambiguity remains, courts consider which agency has greater expertise in the subject matter. Option B is incorrect because simultaneous enforcement of conflicting regulations may not be possible. Option C is incorrect because courts do not always require congressional clarification if reasonable statutory interpretation is available. Option D is incorrect because jurisdictional overlap does not automatically invalidate rule unless the agency has acted ultra vires beyond its statutory authority. Question 19. During a major transformation where existing methods are being replaced with automated decision-making, a federal agency implements an AI-based system for adjudicating benefits claims. Several applicants challenge the system, arguing that it lacks transparency and violates due process. Under administrative law, what key considerations should a court evaluate when determining the system's legality? A. Whether the automated system provides meaningful opportunity for applicants to challenge decisions. B. Whether the AI system has reduced agency backlogs and improved efficiency. C. Whether other agencies have successfully implemented similar automated decision-making. D. Whether Congress has explicitly authorized AI-based decision-making in administrative adjudication. Answer A. Whether the automated system provides a meaningful opportunity for applicants to challenge decisions. Explanation: the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment requires that individuals receive notice and an opportunity to be heard before being deprived of government benefits. Courts apply the Matthews v. Eldridge 1976 balancing test to determine due process requirements in administrative proceedings, considering the private interest at stake, e.g., loss of benefits, the risk of erroneous deprivation through current procedures, the government's interest, including cost and administrative efficiency. While AI-based decision-making may improve efficiency, courts require that individuals have adequate procedural safeguards, such as a process, human oversight, and transparency in decision-making. Option B is incorrect because efficiency alone does not determine due process compliance. Option C is incorrect because the legality of AI use depends on due process considerations, not whether other agencies use it. Option D is incorrect because agencies often implement technology without explicit congressional approval as long as they comply with due process and statutory limits. Question 20. In a situation where formal requirements conflict with practical enforcement challenges, an agency revises its reporting rules for regulated entities. The new rule imposes stricter documentation requirements but lacks clear enforcement guidance. Businesses argue that the rule is too vague and unenforceable. Under administrative law, what principle should a court apply when evaluating the rule's validity? A. The void for vagueness doctrine, requiring that regulations provide clear standards. B. The non-delegation doctrine, ensuring that Congress did not improperly transfer its legislative power. C. The hard look doctrine, assessing whether the agency adequately justified its rule. D. The major questions doctrine, requiring clear congressional authorization for significant new regulations. Answer A. The void for vagueness doctrine, requiring that regulations provide clear standards. Explanation: the void for vagueness doctrine is a constitutional principle that prevents agencies from issuing regulations that fail to provide clear guidance to those subject to them. Under administrative law, a rule is unconstitutionally vague if regulated entities cannot reasonably determine what is required. The rule allows arbitrary or discriminatory enforcement. Agencies must provide clear standards so that businesses can comply without fear of unpredictable enforcement. Option B is incorrect because the non-delegation doctrine applies when Congress improperly transfers legislative power to agencies, not when agencies issue vague rules. Option C is incorrect because the hard look doctrine under the APAT applies to arbitrary and capricious review, not vagueness claims. Option D is incorrect because the major questions doctrine applies to significant policy decisions requiring explicit congressional authorization rather than vague enforcement rules. Question 21. While analyzing the root causes of sequential problems in a regulatory framework, an agency identifies inconsistencies in how different regional offices interpret the same federal statute. The agency issues an interpretive rule clarifying its stance. Regulated entities challenge the rule, arguing that it imposes new obligations without undergoing notice and comment rulemaking. Under administrative law, when is an agency permitted to issue interpretive rules without following formal rulemaking procedures? A. When the rule does not create new legal obligations but merely clarifies existing law. B. When an agency finds that notice and comment rulemaking would be too burdensome. C. When the agency provides a 60-day period for voluntary compliance before enforcement. D. When the interpretive rule aligns with similar rules issued by other federal agencies. Answer A. When the rule does not create new legal obligations but merely clarifies existing law. Explanation. Interpretive rules differ from legislative rules in that they do not create new legal obligations but instead explain an agency's understanding of law. Under 5 U.S.C. SS 553 BA of the APAT, agencies do not need to go through notice and comment rulemaking when issuing interpretive rules, policy statements, or procedural rules. However, if an interpretive rule effectively imposes new obligations, courts may strike it down as an improperly issued legislative rule. Option B is incorrect because agency burden alone does not justify bypassing notice and comment requirements. Option C is incorrect because agencies cannot impose compliance obligations without proper rulemaking, even with grace period. Option D is incorrect because consistency with other agencies does not determine whether rule is interpretive or legislative. Question 22. During an emergency response where multiple areas are impacted by a sudden regulatory change, a federal agency issues a temporary rule restricting access to certain public resources. Several industry stakeholders challenged the rule, arguing that it lacked public participation and imposed undue economic burdens. Under administrative law, what factors determine whether the agency's emergency rule is legally valid? A. Whether the agency had good cause to bypass notice and comment procedures under the APAT. B. Whether the rule aligns with industry expectations and economic feasibility. C. Whether the agency allowed stakeholders to submit post-implementation comments. D. Whether majority of affected entities express support for the rule. Answer A. Whether the agency had good cause to bypass notice and comment procedures under the APAT. Explanation. Under the Administrative Procedure Act APAT, agencies must generally follow notice and comment rulemaking before issuing binding regulations. However, under 5 U.S.C. SS 553 B.3b, agencies may bypass these procedures if they establish good cause that compliance would be impracticable, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. Courts evaluate emergency rules based on the severity of the emergency, e.g., public health crisis, environmental disaster, the immediacy of the agency's need to act, whether delaying action for public input would create significant harm. Option B is incorrect because economic feasibility is not the primary factor in emergency rulemaking validity. Option C is incorrect because post-implementation comments do not replace formal notice and comment procedures. Option D is incorrect because agency rules are not decided by stakeholder votes but by statutory authority and legal standards. Question 23. In a high-stakes environment where multiple challenges arise from conflicting regulations, a state agency issues a rule that appears to contradict federal law. The regulated industry argues that federal law preempts the state rule. How should a court determine whether preemption applies in this case? A. By applying the supremacy clause and evaluating whether federal law expressly or implicitly preempts the state rule. B. By analyzing whether the state rule is necessary to protect local economic interests. C. By determining whether the state law applies only to in-state businesses. D. By assessing whether state agencies consulted with federal regulators before issuing the rule. Answer A. By applying the supremacy clause and evaluating whether federal law expressly or implicitly preempts the state rule. Explanation. Under the supremacy clause, Article Roman Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution, federal law overrides state law in cases of conflict. Courts recognize three types of preemption. Express preemption, when Congress explicitly states that federal law overrides state law. Implied conflict preemption, when compliance with both federal and state law is impossible. Field preemption, when federal regulation is so comprehensive that it leaves no room for state involvement. Option B is incorrect because economic interests do not override federal law. Option C is incorrect because state jurisdiction alone does not prevent preemption. Option D is incorrect because consultation with federal agencies does not determine preemption. The supremacy clause does. Question 24. Why examining inconsistencies across various units within a federal agency, leadership notices that different regional offices apply the same rule with varying degrees of strictness. This inconsistency leads to disputes among regulated entities. What is the most appropriate legal remedy to ensure uniform application of agency rules? A. The agency should issue a binding interpretive rule to clarify how the regulation should be applied. B. The agency should allow each regional office to exercise discretion based on local circumstances. C. The agency should request that Congress amend the underlying statute. D. The agency should wait for courts to resolve disputes through case-by-case adjudication. Answer A. The agency should issue a binding interpretive rule to clarify how the regulation should be applied. Explanation: inconsistent application of agency rules can lead to arbitrary enforcement and legal challenges. Agencies may issue interpretive rules under the Administrative Procedure Act, APA, to provide clarification without engaging in formal rulemaking. These interpretive rules help ensure uniform enforcement without imposing new legal obligations. Option B is incorrect because regional discretion cannot contradict federal regulations. Option C is incorrect because congressional amendments are rarely immediate solutions. Option D is incorrect because courts should not be the primary method for resolving agency inconsistencies. Agencies must act proactively. Question 25. During a comprehensive review of a process that needs improvement, an agency identifies outdated regulations that impose unnecessary burdens on businesses. The agency seeks to rescind these rules, but faces legal challenges from advocacy groups arguing that removal would harm public interests. Under administrative law, what must the agency demonstrate to lawfully repeal a rule? A. That the repeal is supported by a reasoned explanation under the APA. B. That regulated businesses overwhelmingly support the repeal. C. That the rule was originally issued without proper authority. D. That rescinding the rule will not result in any adverse effects. Answer A. That the repeal is supported by a reasoned explanation under the APA. Explanation: under FECV, Fox television stations, 2009, an agency may repeal a regulation as long as it provides a reasoned explanation for the change. Courts review whether the agency's decision was arbitrary and capricious under the APA. The agency does not need to prove the rule was originally unlawful. It only needs to justify its repeal. Agency must consider reliance interests. Whether businesses or the public relied on the original rule, the agency must provide factual basis for why repeal is necessary. Option B is incorrect because public or business support alone does not determine legality. Option C is incorrect because repeal does not require proving the original rule was unlawful. Option D is incorrect because agencies are not required to eliminate all adverse effects, only to justify the policy change. Question 26. When developing a solution that must address opposing needs, an agency issues a rule that attempts to balance environmental protection with economic growth. However, industry groups claim that the rule disproportionately harms them, while environmental groups argue that it is too weak. Under administrative law, what standard will courts apply to determine whether the rule is valid? A. The arbitrary and capricious standard under the Administrative Procedure Act, APA. B. The rational basis test used in constitutional law. C. The clear and convincing evidence standard. D. The strict scrutiny standard. Answer A. The arbitrary and capricious standard under the Administrative Procedure Act, APA. Explanation: under 5 U.S.C. SS 706 2A of the APA, courts review agency regulations under the arbitrary and capricious standard. This test asks: did the agency examine all relevant factors? Did the agency consider alternatives? Did the agency provide rational explanation for its decision? Courts do not require agencies to satisfy all stakeholders, but only to justify why their decision is reasonable and supported by evidence. Option B is incorrect because the rational basis test applies to constitutional challenges, not administrative rulemaking. Option C is incorrect because agencies are not required to meet clear and convincing evidence threshold. Option D is incorrect because strict scrutiny applies to fundamental rights and suspect classifications, not agency regulations. Question 27. Faced with a situation requiring immediate action, a federal agency issues an interim final rule (IFA) to address a significant safety concern. However, affected businesses claim that the agency exceeded its statutory authority by implementing the rule without following standard rulemaking procedures. Under administrative law, what must the agency demonstrate for the IFA to be legally valid? A. That the rule addresses an urgent issue and falls within the agency's delegated powers. B. That affected businesses were consulted before issuing the rule. C. That Congress directly approved the IFA before its implementation. D. That the IFA is supported by at least 51% of public comments received after implementation. Answer A. That the rule addresses an urgent issue and falls within the agency's delegated powers. Explanation. Under the Administrative Procedure Act, APA agencies must generally follow notice and comment procedures before issuing rules. However, interim final rules, IFUs, allow agencies to issue regulations immediately while still allowing for post-implementation public comments. To justify an IFA, an agency must demonstrate urgency. Rule is necessary to address an emergency or imminent harm. Statutory authority. The agency has the legal power to issue the rule. Good cause exception. Compliance with standard rulemaking would be impracticable, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. 5 U.S.C. SS 553b3b. Option B is incorrect because consultation is not legal requirement for IFUs. Option C is incorrect because Congress does not need to approve IFs unless explicitly required by statute. Option D is incorrect because public comments are considered but do not determine the rule's validity. Question 20. Considering how regulatory authority is divided between different levels of government, a state agency enacts a rule that conflicts with an existing federal regulation on workplace safety. A business challenges the state rule, arguing that it is preempted. What is the most relevant legal test that courts will apply? A. Whether Congress has expressly or implicitly preempted state law under the Supremacy Clause. B. Whether the state regulation is more protective of workers than the federal rule. C. Whether the state agency consulted with federal regulators before issuing the rule. D. Whether state courts uphold the validity of the rule. Answer A. Whether Congress has expressly or impliedly preempted state law under the Supremacy Clause. Explanation. Under the Supremacy Clause, Article omens Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution, federal law takes precedence over conflicting state laws. Courts apply the preemption doctrine, which includes express preemption, when federal law explicitly states that it overrides state law; implied preemption, when state law conflicts with federal law or stands as an obstacle to achieving federal objectives; field preemption, when federal regulation is so comprehensive that no room is left for state laws. Option B is incorrect because state laws do not override federal laws simply by being more protective. Option C is incorrect because consultation does not determine preemption. Option D is incorrect because state court rulings cannot override federal law. Question 29. In response to a complex challenge involving regulatory consistency, an agency adopts a new policy that reverses a long-standing interpretation of a rule. Affected industries argue that the change is arbitrary and capricious. How must the agency justify its change under administrative law? A. By providing a reasoned explanation under the arbitrary and capricious standard of the APA. B. By proving that the previous interpretation was legally invalid. C. By showing that industry stakeholders support the change. D. By obtaining congressional approval before implementing the change. Answer A. By providing a reasoned explanation under the arbitrary and capricious standard of the APA. Explanation. Under FCC v. Fox Television Stations, 2009, an agency may change its interpretation of a regulation as long as it provides a reasoned explanation under the Administrative Procedure Act. APA. Courts will assess: did the agency acknowledge the change and explain why? Did the agency consider reliance interests? Did the agency provide substantial evidence supporting the new interpretation? Option B is incorrect because an agency does not have to prove the previous interpretation was invalid. only that the new interpretation is justified. Option C is incorrect because stakeholder support is not required for legal validity. Option D is incorrect because agencies do not need congressional approval for regulatory changes unless law specifically requires it. Question 30. Amid an evolving regulatory landscape, an administrative agency issues an interpretive rule to clarify an existing regulation. However, affected parties argue that the rule imposes new legal obligations. Under administrative law, how do courts determine whether the agency's action is an interpretive rule or legislative rule requiring notice and comment procedures? A. By evaluating whether the rule creates new binding obligations beyond the existing statute or regulation. B. By determining whether the agency solicited public comments before issuing the rule. C. By assessing whether the rule affects more than 50% of regulated entities. D. By examining whether industry stakeholders object to the rule. Answer A. By evaluating whether the rule creates new binding obligations beyond the existing statute or regulation. Explanation. Courts distinguish between interpretive rules and legislative rules based on whether the rule binds regulated parties. Key factors: interpretive rules explain or clarify existing regulations without adding new requirements, do not require notice and comment rulemaking. Legislative rules create binding legal obligations, require notice and comment procedures under the Administrative Procedure Act, APAT. Option B is incorrect because soliciting public comments is not required for interpretive rules. Option C is incorrect because the percentage of affected entities does not determine the rule's classification. Option D is incorrect because stakeholder objections do not change whether rule is interpretive or legislative.